So let's start. My name is Bruce Kogut. Thank you all for joining us. And good afternoon. It's one of these rooms that was optimally constructed for conversation. So, but please, in the end, come in and talk to us. We have a great honor today on this topic of trade and jobs, perspectives from Sweden, to have the Minister for European Affairs and Trade in Sweden, Ms. Linde, who will talk about the many issues which come up in transatlantic as well as EU trade, including some new developments this past week with Canada. Sweden has had a long history, obviously, of trade. Most of us know it's from the days when it was a Viking power, which it actually was very good at. Comparative advantage made its name. But then they quickly learned that there might be other ways to pursue these particular goals. And since then, has always been a proponent for free trade and the importance of free trade with all its multinational corporations around the world as well. So we're very happy to have this conversation. Minister Linde is working for, obviously, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She represents Sweden in the European Union. She's working previously in public administration and also in youth and student organizations. Knowing something about Sweden, we'll leave that to the private conversations for you to pursue, but I'm sure you're engaged in many things at that time regarding international business at large. So Professor Stiglitz is someone we don't have to say a lot about, but why not? Because he's our treasure. So Nobel Prize winner in economics, a person of profound insight into how financial markets work in accordance of understanding information, which is a background to many topics which we are discussing. A book, which I guess is coming out in the second edition. Is that correct, Joe? Or
came out. Yeah.
On globalization and discontents revisited, and then with the title of Anti-Globalization in the Era of Trump. So we don't have to pursue one's views on that particular person on this, Joe, but you are been wonderfully outspoken on these issues. Personally, I just lead I work at the business school over at sociology, and I lead the Center for Leadership in Ethics. I married a Swede, became Swedish. I guess that's worth something in this room. It means a lot at home. I'll tell you that much. So, and I wanted to thank also the Consul General Leif Podolsky, who I've seen at a number of events, usually sitting up here and me down below. It's always a pleasure to see you, and thank you so much for initiating this project. I'm going to turn this over to our speakers, and then we'll come back to general conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you mentioned the Vikings, because we were, of course, very successful as the Vikings, and very tough and very hard. And now, when we cannot do that anymore, we play it out in Netflix. And actually, my daughter's best friend played the Queen of Astrid. So, so sometimes I have to follow it, even if it's not my favorite. But anyway, but I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank the European Institute here at Columbian University, and Francois and his team. And of course, it's a big pleasure and honor for me to be at the same table as Professor Stiglitz. You don't remember it, but actually, I had lunch with you in Stockholm when you got your prize. We were only four. It was you and Anja and myself and one person more. That was very strong memory. I guess you thought of other things at that time. But anyway, before I give my view on the global trade policy, I would like to explain why open trade is so important to me as a Minister of Trade of Sweden. because Sweden has been a trading organization all the way from the Vikings until now. It's the engine between Sweden's economic growth and prosperity, supporting private and public consumption, and it's supporting our welfare state as such. Trade and investment policy is an integral part of Sweden's economic policy. Our foreign trade generates 1.4 million jobs, and it's crucial for Sweden's economy and labor market. Close to 1/3 of all jobs in Sweden are sustained by exports. Simply put, saying no to trade has never been an option for us. 99.86% of the world's consumer does not live in Sweden. So support for open markets in the EU as well as globally is an obvious choice for us. Over the next 10 to 15 years, 90% of the global economic growth is expected to be generated outside of Europe. Our trade policy needs to ensure that we can reap the benefits that come with trading with a growing world. An interesting feature of the Swedish political landscape is that free trade enjoys strong support among the political parties, among trade unions, the business community, and the public. I'm often asked, why is it in this way? I believe that Swedish public support for open trade has at least 3 explanations. Firstly, the Swedish tradition of close and constructive cooperation between business and labor is crucial. Being a small trade-dependent nation, both companies and trade unions have generally agreed over the years that international competitiveness is in the interest of everyone in the long run. This model has led to real wage increases steadily over the past 25 years, and export-oriented business have retained their global competitiveness thanks to investment in skills and new technologies. Without openness and international cutting-edge competition, this would not have happened. Secondly, the Swedish welfare system protects people, not jobs. Unemployment benefits, pensions and health cares are universal and not tied to your employer. Like in any other country, losing your job in Sweden is tough, but it's not disastrous for you as an individual. It does not mean that you lose your house, your health care, or your opportunities for education and, maybe more important, retraining. Thirdly, our system of setting wages as well as our tax policy distribute the wealth we create more evenly than in many other countries. This means fewer people get left behind, society is kept together, and people can, rather quickly, get back to working life. The fact that there is a public support for open trade in a small country of 10 million people is not much of a consolation in a world where openness and free trade are under threat from many directions. Just before Christmas, I attended the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires. And let me tell you, in terms of moving the global rule-based system forward, the result was meager, to say the least. It was disastrous, to say the most. Rules need to develop because the world and how we trade and do business change. We all know multilateral talks are challenging, but at this stage, we have major players in the system that don't seem to even want the system to function. The WTO as an organization is being mistreated by the very nation that created it. This is serious, and it means by all leaders, myself included, that we need to constantly defend the system and explain its benefits. International trade needs clear and fair international rules. All countries need to adhere to such a system which provides benefits for all. The anti-trade rhetoric is not only empty talk. Since the financial crisis, far more trade restrictive than liberalization measures have been put in place. In fact, over 5,000 trade restrictive measures have been implemented globally, versus only 1,500 liberalizing measures. Protectionism risks hitting fragile and vulnerable countries hardest, with negative effects such as youth unemployment and increased radicalization. There seem to be many reasons for this sudden backlash against open trade. One criticism of open trade focuses on trade balance. The idea is that having a trade surplus vis-à-vis another country is good and having a deficit is bad. But bilateral trade balance is a complex issue. Trade deficits and surpluses, as well as the notion of export and imports, do not show the whole picture in a world of global value chains. Global value chains are today a reality, with components being produced, assembled, shipped and sold in several different countries. It's the value chains that creates, not trade surpluses, that bring us wealth. As one example, the Volvo XC90 consists of 10,000 parts from 98 different countries. Without the import of those components, the export of the finished car would not be possible, or at least not in the current form or at today's price. Only through access to global value chains can production facilities in Sweden be competitive and create wealth. Not only goods and services need to flow for the global value chains to work, but also data. Digitalization is changing everything from business models to products and consumer patterns. We have only seen the beginning of this transformation. It goes beyond the IT sector, and it's of great importance to all companies, from startups and small and medium-sized companies to multinational enterprises. According to McKinsey Global Institute, e-commerce is expected to increase almost 30% in volume by 2020. Data flows are expected to increase ninefold over the next 5 years. An open and responsible policy on data flow is part and a parcel of an open trade policy. The EU is working hard to create a true digital internal market and to promote free data flows. I have taken the initiative to launch Digital 9 Agenda together with the 8 other EU member states that are the digital frontrunners in EU. Together we contribute to advancing the digital agenda of the EU, building on our expertise and experiences to ensure that growth and new jobs are created with the objective of keeping them in Europe. Therefore, I'm proud that the D9 can be an example of a visionary leadership where politics is required to improve the conditions for the digitalization of the single market. The group has created a platform for dialogue with business and stakeholders, and their input is important in the process of developing the digital single market. And it's also a dialogue with trade unions and consumer organizations. But while it may be true that global value chains of goods, services and data create a complex trading system, the notion still persists that imports mean foreigners are stealing jobs. The fear is fueled in the EU as well in other places by populism. Economists might tell you that trade neither creates nor destroys jobs, it merely assists in creating wealth. But as long as people, especially young or disenfranchised people, feel that they are not getting a share of that wealth, we know for a fact that trade policy will take a blow. The solution is to offer safety nets strong enough to welcome structural change and an active labor market policy with collective agreements and social insurance schemes. We need to protect people, not every workplace. We need to protect competitiveness, not every company. Another serious challenge is that globalization in general, and trade in particular, could potentially lead to a race to the bottom in terms of environmental and social protection. The risk is obvious if countries are competing by lowering their levels of protection. But this is exactly why we need more global rules, not fewer. Global problems need global solutions. Sweden is committed to working for a progressive trade agenda and modern trade agreements. I believe that trade goes hand in hand with ensuring the protection of environment, labor interest and public health, and with the aim of achieving universal goals such as the 2030 Agenda and promoting gender equality. In my experience, the promotion of such policy objective is fully compatible with the promotion of open trade. Trade can and should play an important role in meeting these objectives. Let me just say a few words about globalization and the European Union. Despite a challenging time lately, including the process of Brexit, optimism about the future of the EU has grown. Cooperation has proved to work well, and the member states were able to progress in a number of different ways in 2017 in a targeted and constructive way. We can see a clear consensus among the member states, a more stable EU, and discussions about the future of EU at several summits. As for economic recovery in the EU, we can now see positive signals. In November 2017, the Commission presented its autumn forecast confirming that economic recovery in the Union has gained ground. In 2017, both the Eurozone and the EU were showing the highest growth in a decade. Several member states now have more stable public finances. Unemployment continued to decline. I believe there are good reasons to remain optimistic. As we continue to push for more open and free trade, we must also push for greater security and social justice for our citizens. Sweden knows this. All jobs have disappeared and new ones have emerged. What was outdated and inefficient has been replaced by something more modern and efficient. In closing, I would like to say that globalization is not a choice, it's a fact. The political choice lies in how we deal with the challenges and opportunities it creates. Jobs are connected, my job can serve your demand and vice versa. But let us remember, only a global marketplace let us discover the very best to serve one another. And if I have made you curious about Sweden, let me tell you that there is a way to experience Sweden and Swedish society firsthand for young men and women like yourself here today. Now it's time for advertisement. My government and the Swedish Institute and the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce, and the two leaders, Anna Tronholst and Annika Rembe, is sitting on the first row. They have started a collaboration that will enable young American professionals within the tech sector to do a traineeship in Sweden. Because it's through you, the young, that we build long-lasting and ever deeper ties between our nations. And in a world that is changing at an ever faster pace, the younger generation will need to show the rest of us how we move forward. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to share my views with you and with Anne here, the minister here. Let me say, one of the reasons I was enthusiastic about accepting this is I do think that Sweden is the right model. And Leif and I have been talking about having a seminar to try to explain more broadly to Americans about what it is about Sweden that has enabled it to cope as well as it has with globalization, with trade, and that there's nothing about the Swedish model that is not replicable in the United States. You know, a lot of people say, well, what can work for a small country of 9 million, relatively homogeneous, would not work in the United States. I think that's totally wrong. I think the basic principles that the minister outlined in terms of active labor market, policy, social protection, industrial policies, you can talk about that very much, But most of those policies are tools that obviously have to be adapted to the American situation, but are tools that would work in the United States. And so I just wish you could do more propaganda in trying to convince Americans that the right way to go is the Swedish way and not the protectionism of Trump. Because I do agree that very strongly that just like no economy, the American economy can't work without a rule of law. Internationally, we need a rule of law, and that's what the rules-based system is. We can all disagree about, what are the right rules and the wrong rules, and I've been very concerned about some of the rules of globalization are not the right rules, and I'll make some specific comments later on. The idea that you need a rule of law for governing within a country and governing between countries should be obvious by now. And that is, to be quite frank, the opposite of the view of the United States. And at that meeting in Buenos Aires, the U.S. trade representative actually said we need less litigation. By that, he meant less use of the WTO appeals process and more negotiation, by which he means moving to the law of the jungle, where the power of the United States to get what it wants will prevail over a rule of law. And that is, I think, counterproductive even for the United States, but I certainly understand why a small country would think the rule of the jungle is not a good framework for going forward. But I think you can't have a global system work under the rule of the jungle. The topic of this afternoon was jobs and trade, so let me spend a few minutes on that explicitly. The minister was right that in many ways, most economists don't think jobs are what trade is about. But trade ministers, USTR, and governments often talk about it that way. So, and a lot of individuals, citizens think about it that way. The point is that if you listen to the U.S. trade representative or Trump, it's always about how exports create jobs, and they'll say how many jobs were created by exports. But if exports create jobs, imports destroy jobs. And in a world of roughly trade balance where exports equal imports, the two are balanced, except when you're in a country like the United States or Sweden. When you increase trade, the exports tend to be more capital intensive, and the imports tend to be more labor intensive. So when you expand trade, you destroy jobs. But the point is, that's not the responsibility of trade policy. The point about trade policy is to increase standards of living. So jobs might be destroyed, but that's where macro policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy is supposed to restore the economy to full employment. So but when markets aren't working well, and they have not been working very well in the United States for certainly since for most of the century, what happens is jobs get destroyed faster than new jobs get created, and in different places than where they get created. So there have been actually some very good studies, very impressive studies, which have looked at the consequences of the surge of imports that happened after China got admitted to the WTO in the beginning of the century. And Chinese exports to the United States went way up. And what you find is that in those places in the United States that were producing goods that were competitive with the goods for which there was a surge of imports, wages are lower, unemployment is higher, property values are down. So there is now some, you might say, econometric basis for the view that trade has been difficult for the United States. But as Leif keeps insisting, it's not globalization the problem, It's the way we responded to the globalization. And the way we responded was not adequate. It did not have the range of tools that Sweden used in responding, and didn't even use macroeconomic policies in an effective way. Some of you may remember in 2009 and 10, when we needed a big stimulus, our unemployment was high, there were some, and I know this is I don't want to sound partisan, but it's just a fact, the Republicans opposed a bigger stimulus on the grounds, can you believe it, that it would have a deficit effect? Far smaller than the $1 to $2 trillion that they just had to give a tax cut for the billionaires and the corporations. But when it was a tax cut that would stimulate the economy and therefore more equitably shared, or spending on infrastructure, they opposed it. So we didn't have the macroeconomic response that we needed, and the result of that is the unemployment that appeared. Now actually, traditional economic theory has always been very clear that for an advanced country like the United States, opening up trade with a less developed country, China, India, will lead to lower wages for unskilled labor. So the adverse distribution effects that we have seen, and they have been very serious, were predictable. They were predicted and they were predictable. And again, it's something that was not, we could have done something about. So the standard precept in economics is not that everybody is necessarily made better off by trade, but that the gains of the economy as a whole are large enough that everybody could be made better off. But the theory never was that everybody would be better off. It required a politics that said that some of the gains of the winners had to be shared with those of the losers. And America's winners, our corporations, were quite frankly very greedy. And they didn't want to share any of their gains with the losers. And the result of that is the politics that we've had. There have been large losers. And there's a gender element of this on the other side of what you've been talking about. The median income, median half above, half below, of a full-time male worker, and the lucky ones are the ones who are full-time, the full median income of a full-time male worker in the United States are the same level as they were 42 years ago. So there have been 2 generations of stagnation. And at the bottom, real wages are the same level that they were 60 years ago. So if you are, you're watching television and you see a lot of people look like they're doing very well, you're advertising all these products, it is natural that you become angry. And particularly when you have elites, like, I won't name names, but who say that globalization is going to, and liberalization, is going to make everybody better off, and when you are worse off, it leads to a distrust in the system because the elites you felt lied to by these elites. Now let me just emphasize that none of this was inevitable. The policies that Sweden has undertaken could have prevented all these effects. But particularly the winners in this process and the way our politics has moved to a system of $1, one vote from one person to one vote makes that very, very difficult. Let me just say a couple of points about some of the more recent trade agreements that sort of frame some of the things that are going on. The first point is that recent trade agreements like TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, that Trump walked away from the first day in office, was not mostly about trade. The net effect on U.S. GDP was estimated by the government as 0.15% of GDP after 15 years when it was fully implemented. Now that's close to zero. Other more independent economists like at Tufts University said that the government estimate was a gross exaggeration. The number was much closer to zero or even negative. There are some other studies that say the government, for some mysterious reason, underestimated, but I find that implausible. But anyway, it was small. So what was all the hype about this agreement? Well, there are two other parts that provided a lot of the impetus for it. One is investment agreement. And the investment agreement has been part of all the trade agreements basically over the last 25 years. And one can understand the notion of investment agreement. You are investing and you want to have protection of your property rights. But that's not what these investment agreements are about. These investment agreements are about stopping regulation. And that's why the corporations want them. And they're about another thing. They're about driving down wages of workers. So there are two parts of the agenda. Why do I say driving down wages of workers? Well, they actually give American firms investing abroad more property rights than American investors are investing at home. So if you invest abroad, you're safer than if you invest in the United States. To give you an example, oh, okay. I can't just take my word for it.
I don't.
Okay, then I'll have to explain it. Okay, so there's the question is, what happens, a good investment agreement would say you can't discriminate. And a good investment agreement would be predicated on the fact that actually in the United States and in Europe, we actually have good systems of property right protection. We are not, if you invest in Europe, you have good courts, and so the government's not going to seize your property, and I trust the Swedish legal system to protect me. But the question is, do you need extra protection beyond the Swedish courts? Well, the thing you might worry about is the Swedish courts might discriminate against an American. So you might want to have a provision that says, after you've exhausted the Swedish legal system, you want to be able to check whether Sweden has discriminated against Americans. But that's nothing to do with what these investment agreements are about. What these investment agreements say is that if you change the legal framework, for instance, if you discover that asbestos is dangerous for your health, or that there's such a thing as climate change, and you change the regulations to regulate carbon emissions, asbestos, anything, and the value of the asset goes down, you can be sued. This is not hypothetical. Philip Morris sued Uruguay because Uruguay passed a regulation saying that you had to label cigarettes. And there have been dozens of suits, and Canada has lost about 19 of these suits already. Now, they're going to say, oh, we put some provision to make sure that this no longer holds. And and the CETA, the Canadian European Agreement, is better in the way the system works than NAFTA and some of the other ones. But I've had lawyers look at that agreement, and their interpretation is different from the official interpretation. And so what you can be certain about is that there is uncertainty and there will be litigation. So that's one thing they're about. They're also about intellectual property rights to make generic medicines less accessible. And so when you look at these trade agreements in a modern world, they're just not just about trade. They have lots of other things going in them. And these are done by trade ministers, but at least in the United States, behind closed doors, where we don't see all that's going on, and in Europe they've done it much more transparent way, and they're working to get it still more transparent, and that's another thing we need to learn from Sweden. But when you have it down behind closed doors with corporations at the table and civil society not at the table, you get the kinds of results of the agreements that we've had.
Thank you, Joe. You've shown us that you can be diplomatic and honest at the same time. You have some more response to these comments?
Yes, just let me say a few words about investment courts, because of course I don't agree. One thing is, it's true that there has been a lot of protests against the investment courts, and we have listened very carefully to that. So in the new EU-Canadian agreement, we have changed the court. So now it will be judges that is appointed before you have any complaint. So it's not the companies who take out their judges, but it's before. And you can appeal. That was not possible before. But the thing is that we ministers, we actually had to sit and draft, and I was there, so I know it. We had to sit and draft a specific instrument because there was so much myth and outright lies about what it is. So it's not true that you cannot have higher environment or health or anything like that just because there is an investment court. It's not true that you can sue a country because you have not the profit that you wanted to have. That's not in the investment core. What it is to have a proper possibility for a company that invests if you are not treated in a way that is the same way as your company is treated from your own state. For example, it's you have a tourist project in Libya where the Libyan state has not paid the bills. You have real estate in Kyrgyzstan where the Kyrgyzstan state has expropriated. You have a glass factory in Venezuela. You even have a Swedish sugar company who didn't get paid. We have in Sweden around 65 bilateral investment court treaties. We have never been sued. And what you took from Uruguay, I always hear this Philip Morris case, and the fact is that they have lost. They have sued.
But it was 2-1.
But they have lost. Yeah, but the thing is, everybody say, but Philip Morris, they have not won. So why is that keeping coming up all the time? It's not the possibility. And I also think that it is fair that if there is a Swedish company, for example, having an investment in Texas, and they are then treated not fairly by the Texas government, which would be more possible for the Swedish company to get right, by the Texas judge with an all-American juror, or by a court where you have judges from 3 different countries that is appointed from beforehand. I would say the second. That would be much, much fairer to the Swedish company than to be totally depending on the Texas juror. But I also have to say, if this is not something that people want, it is possible to have trade agreement without it. I think it would be bad because it will be less investment, and especially for companies not coming from maybe very big countries, it will be more unsafe. But it is also possible. And in some countries they have laws against appeal courts. You have it in the sports all the time. You don't go to the normal system. You have sports judges all the time. You could have it here too. But in Brazil, for example, they don't allow it. So Brazil trade agreement don't have it. As I said, Sweden has 62 or 65, something like that, bilateral. So I think it's possible. But I must say that it is not true that you cannot regulate when it comes to health and to labor's right and so, because that is written into the new agreement. That's my position.
Can I just make one?
I'm not here this audience.
Okay.
My guess, Joe, is that they are enjoying this.
Yes.
And I think we should respond.
Okay. So
But
just
not-
very.
but not too long.
Okay. Let me say, you can obviously write a trade agreement without these provisions, and I think they should be done because they are so controversial. Canada has lost a large number of agreements. There are interesting studies that show that the United States has not lost any, and there are some interesting studies that suggest that the size makes a difference. But let me just make a couple points.
Just one point.
Oh.
But I think one point we should say is that was a magnificent response you got there, Joe. Wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a very good response. That's right. So the fact is that there are two parts of the objections. One is the legal process by which it's adjudicated, and the other one is what you can sue for, and what is the compensation that you get when you prevail. And all of these are different pieces. So that, for instance, the compensation you get is not just your lost investment, which I can understand, but your lost expected future profits, which is a very speculative number. And that huge number incentivizes people to sue whenever you change a little bit of the legal framework. Now, you could change that provision. And in TPP, we put in a provision because we knew that there was going to be, the government put in a provision, knew that there would be all this complaining, saying something like, notwithstanding, we are all in favor of good regulations. But you read the text of it, you talk to lawyers and say, what does that mean? It means they're going to go ahead and sue. In fact, the guy who was the lawyer who helped write the NAFTA provision put it very forcefully. He said, we could put plutonium in a baby cereal, and if you try to stop us from doing that, we will sue. And that this provision would give them the right to sue. Now, whether they win or not, always there's going to be a question. But that was a 2-to-1 decision. And you can imagine if that one guy had gone the other way, Uruguay would have had to pay a lot of money, as Canada has had to pay. Moreover, it has a chilling effect. Canada has given in on a lot of cases. Rather than go to litigation, they get sued and they say, okay, we'll take away our regulations. So it is really having a chilling effect on the regulations and okay.
That was fantastic. Isn't that great? So, I'm really nervous. This is a panel about jobs. I'm afraid that Francois will fire me if I don't. Let's take some questions, please.
Stiglitz, you pointed out that there's a possibility of a Pareto improvement with trade. But I think the fact is, sort of history shows us that the U.S. government, U.S. people are really opposed to redistribution. They're really not going to do it, and we get less redistribution rather than more over time. So my question to you is, what policy should we pursue with trade in light of that? What second?
I think one has to be very cautious is the answer. The point is, without using technical jargon, if you can't get the compensation, and so that it is the case that trade has a very big risk of making the poor people even poorer, then I think you have to move much more deliberately and package the things together. So, for instance, many of us said that to succeed in our trade to have a trade agreement, we needed to have trade adjustment assistance. This was a kind of active labor market policy aimed at those who were losing jobs. And the Republicans said no, basically, and we won't fund it if we do approve it. And I think the Democrats at that point should have drawn the line and said, if you don't do that, you don't get the trade agreement. So I think you have to link the two together much more. But I think actually what we need to do is move much more to the system. It's not about redistribution here. It's about having systems of active labor market, social protection. So not phrasing it in terms of redistribution, but in terms of social protection and economic efficiency. Moving people from unemployment to employment is something that should benefit our whole economy. So I would not use the word redistribution. I would talk about it in terms of making our markets work better.
And on this one, I totally agree with Professor Stiglitz, because you cannot just say that trade is good for everybody, because it's not good for some people, because the competition is hardened. And if you have a company that is not up to the competition, that company might have to close down, and then all the people lose their jobs. So for those people, of course, it's not good. But if you see it as a whole, then you could say it's better for the society if you are on the top of the competition, if you can really fight with all the bests in the world. And actually, it means that reskilling is a key. If you don't have reskilling programs, then it will be very tough. And I would also say, of course, some social security, labor security and so on. One example, in Gothenburg, which is the second biggest town in Sweden, we had a big shipyard. 7,000 people lost their jobs when the shipyards were no longer competitive. And of course it's a big blow for all those people who loses their jobs. But instead of keeping a shipyard that we know we cannot compete anymore because our shipyards are too expensive, well, there was a restructuring. Now at the very same place in Gothenburg, there is 14,000 people working in a big life science campus with new innovative work. And people who lost their jobs, they get, of course, reskilled and everything. So you have to see it in that way. And for a single person, it is tough to lose your job, even if you get, reskilled and everything. But for Sweden, with 10 million inhabitants, that's the only way. And I think that the United States, even if you are so big, also could win with that kind of policy. Not only because it's good for people, but because it's also good for the country.
There's more questions over. I promised my wing people that I would use. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Hi, I just have a quick question. I can already guess the answer. Is it even worth talking about TTIP anymore nowadays, especially with the current U.S. government?
Well, it's actually more complicated than that, because Trump made a reference at Davos to rejoining TTIP, and it was partly because the other 11 countries have agreed to go ahead. But it's interesting, they've agreed to go ahead dropping some of the worst provisions of TTIP that the United States government had insisted. And one of them that he cut me off from talking about were the provisions from, the provisions on generic medicine. And as an example of the nature of those negotiations, I had talked to all, I had tried to talk to all the health negotiators in TTIP. 11 out of the 12 were interested in talking about how to shape an agreement that was protective of health. There was one country that was not interested in talking, and that was the United States. And so the 11 countries decided to go ahead without the very noxious provisions that we had insisted in putting in.
from the EU side, we have not closed the door, and we think that the negotiation that ended with Obama was actually going a long way, and we think it would be a mistake just to throw it away. It seems like right now there is not a political appetite in US to continue, but we also consider that US has not closed the door fully. So I think it's possible to continue, maybe not in a few years, but maybe the next president, or even if, well, not even if. But I think there needs to be some kind of a trade agreement, because both EU and US would benefit a lot of it. So I think we should continue at some point or another.
Yes, we have two people over there. But looking to my right as well.
What will happen now that the EU is saying they will only work with other countries in the Paris Agreement?
Sorry, in
Paris Agreement. If the US is not in the Paris Agreement, it's been said that the treaty will only cover countries within the Paris Agreement. That just came out yesterday.
no, what EU has said is that we need to take a bigger responsibility to continue the Paris Agreement. And at the last summit in Bonn, there was agreement to continue. Unfortunately, it was not the best result. We would have wanted a better result in Bonn than we actually got. But you can also say that there is an urgency for EU when US has pulled back to take a bigger responsibility. And yesterday there was a decision in this, and now I don't know the English word, utsläppsrätter, emission rights. Well, yesterday there was an important decision where EU Parliament took a decision to lower the number of emission rights, because if you have many emission rights, it means that it's useless. The idea is that, you know. So yesterday the Parliament took that decision, and I think that it would be 1,000 times better if the US decides to continue to go back in again, and Trump said that maybe he will. We don't know.
Can I ask a question?
But otherwise it will not die. It will not die, but it's more difficult.
Would the EU contemplate having a cross-border tax on countries that are a rogue state, are not participating in Paris, so that they can't dump their steel produced by carbon emitting technologies in Europe?
Very French to me.
A tax on those countries?
No, on the products that are produced. In other words, if Europe goes and does what it should be doing, which is reducing its emissions and making sure that people are producing by means of, you might say, green technologies, and that gives a competitive advantage to the United States because it's using very dirty technologies. Shouldn't Europe impose a tax on those goods exported from the United States?
I don't know the exact answer to this. What I do know is that the European Union Commission has proposed to put a tax on plastic, because plastic is really destroying the oceans right now. This has other. I don't say I'm in favor of it, because there are other issues of having the possibility for EU to take taxes, but that is on the table now. Then when it comes to what you are saying, it's not discussed in that way at the moment. It's discussed in the way if we should put taxes on steel as such, which we have done now, and that is something that Sweden is against, but the EU.
No, but I'm saying using tax policy, because otherwise it puts European producers at an unfair advantage, as America is producers basically are subsidized in effect
Yeah.
because they get access to carbon at a zero price, and your guys are going to be charged $80 in Sweden. It's 150.
I haven't seen that proposal, so I cannot.
I've been
give
making
an-
it for a number of
you-
years.
I cannot give an answer to it.
So this falls on the topic of externalities. And when there's limited time and many hands up, every question has an externality. So I'm going to suggest the following. Let's just say a handful here. We have two here, but I'm going to take one first. Take two questions together, and let's see how much time is left over. Here first.
Yeah, just a quick question to the minister. So I'm wondering if you're maybe underestimating the threat posed to the kind of Swedish way of doing things by populists, and overestimating the ability of Swedish governments moving forward to use the tools of social policy and active labor market policy moving forward. Professor Stiglitz has described in the United States these tools are completely politicized and almost impossible to use. Republicans block them, the Democrats propose them. And in Sweden and in the other Scandinavian countries, you've got welfare chauvinists that are teaming up with, bizarre libertarians in proposing privatization of the welfare system, privatization of active labor market services. And so I'm a little bit skeptical of, moving forward the Swedish government's ability to use these tools to spread the gains of trade equally and keep populists from coming into power and changing things.
Okay, so is that policy feasible politically in Sweden? I'm sorry, the last question, and then.
Okay, so this is to Mr. Stiglitz. So you've traditionally spoken against the euro and quoting against the disciplined budgetary austerity plans commanded by Germany. And I quote, austerity plans lead to disaster, or have this clear austerity is not going to work. And I can give you many specific facts about Spain and the consequences of the austerity budget in the last 7 years. But to give you very few facts, the Eurozone economy is estimated to grow 2.1% this year. We're said to be on track to grow at the fastest pace in a decade. The rate of unemployment increased importantly. The external surplus has never been so high, and the public deficit is much lower than the US. So I'm just wondering if there is an underlying motivation for the euro to disappear and to avoid competition with the euro, given that right now it's at 1.22 the change. So,
This is great to have these small questions.
Well, thank you for the question about being able to keep the policy. I think that we will be able to keep the policy because there is a general notion that universal welfare is actually working. The big fight right now is if it is possible for private companies to carry out education and healthcare and everything like that, and if they should be continued to take out profit. That is the big fight, and Sweden is the only country in the world now that is accepting companies to take out unlimited profit for education. And now there is a proposal from the government, but we are in a minority, to have a 7% cap on the profit. I don't know how it will go when the parliament is going to vote for this, because there is no clear majority and the government is in a minority. But that is the issue, not whether we should continue to have universal welfare.
So on the other question, I was never against the euro. What I said is it was an incomplete project, and the way it was designed made it very difficult, almost impossible for you to adjust to shocks. When I say particular countries that were adversely affected by the shock couldn't adjust quickly, and the cost to them, especially through austerity, could be enormous. I still believe that, and in fact, the evidence is that every downturn eventually comes to an end. The question about policy is, was the suffering between the time of the beginning of the crisis and the time it gets over deeper and greater than it had to be. And there's absolutely no doubt that the euro has resulted, and the associated austerity policies have resulted in untold pain in Spain and in Portugal, which is actually doing a better job of recovering, and even more in Greece. My concern is that today, with this recovery, so-called recovery, it's still unemployment rate, I think, in Spain is unacceptably high, and in Greece it's even higher. But that complacency that everybody says, like you said, oh, it's growing now, is growing, but with still an unemployment rate that is twice that, even for the euro as a whole, of that of the United States, it illustrates the rigidities that the euro has imposed. So what I hope is that they use the time now to finish the euro project. For instance, the banking union. Everybody's agreed on the notion of a banking union, but Germany has been particularly dragging its feet at the critical part of the banking union, which is common deposit insurance. And you go through all the institutional reforms, and every time you say, here are the institutional reforms you need to make it work, when I talk to the European officials, they say, oh yes, I agree, but it's politically very, very difficult. And I say, well, it's very, very difficult for the people who are starving to death because of your policies. It's not only politically difficult, it's economically difficult. So to me, what I do hope that this respite will provide time in which they will actually complete the project that they started in 1992.
So I want to thank everyone very, very much, the European Institute, François Calvadia, also again, Pastor General, Minister Potowski, Joe, always great. And thank you so much for coming.